Yeah, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, can see your screen.
Okay. All right. Thank you again for the opportunity to talk with you about my research. So a big question that I always hope to answer is to what extent different types of news media, traditional, new, legacy, partisan, influence public opinion and their behavior. So I've done a lot of research on focus on this topic. And today I'm going to present some of my recent studies focus on this issue of gun violence in the United States to showcase this line of my research. And when presenting my work, I have several goals in mind. And the first one is to talk about the importance of theory, right? So I know this is a computational research workshop, and you all are going to learn a lot of different fancy methods, analyses. But my message is that we do not want to do computational research for the sake of computation, for the sake of fancy numbers, fancy data, fancy analysis. As Com Scholar, our goal is to advance theories, right? So a big theory that I tackle in my work is agenda settings theory. And this is a very classic and a very old theory in our field. And I want to illustrate how we can use the new methods, computational methods, to advance our understanding of a classic theory in our field. And another goal in mind is I wanted to show you how we can combine computational methods and traditional methods in our field, like survey, like experiment, and how this combination can give us more insights, perspectives about the problems, about the questions that we are trying to understand. So I currently work at Fudan, but before that, I taught at Boston University. And at the time, I led a research group called the Artificial Intelligence and Emergent Media Research Group, and we call ourselves AIM. And this is a cross-disciplinary research group. We have com scholars, including me and my students, and we also have professors and students from computer science. So we do research together. So basically, they provide methods, they provide tools, and trying to help us to answer our questions and the theories that we want to advance. And the work that I'm going to present today is also one project out of this research group. So we've been working on a lot of different issues like migration, like climate change. But today I'm going to talk about our research on the gun violence issue in the United States. So let me just give you a little bit background context about this topic. So as you can see from this chart, so the gun violence is a very serious topic in the United States. So this chart shows you the number of gun deaths per 100,000 people in 2017. And you can see the number for the United States is 4. And all the other countries, including Singapore, the number is 0.02, 0.04. So you can see the dramatic difference between the United States and many other countries. And this chart is back from 2017. And I believe that this difference, this contrast might be even more severe, obvious in recent years these days, as you can see news about mass shootings, gun violence almost every day about what's happening in the United States. And this is actually not something that you just read from news. So if you live in the United States, this is something you actually will have personal experience. So for me, back in 2010, at the time, I was actually working on my PhD degree at the University of Texas at Austin. And in September 2010, a student actually opened fire at the campus and then shot himself later on. So fortunately for this incident, there were no injuries, no deaths, but it's still very scary, right? Because it just took place at the place, at the library that I went every day. So every time something like this happened, you will think, now the government should do something, right? Should make some change, should introduce some laws to control the gun violence. But nothing happened since then. And even worse, 5 years after that incident, we did not see any measures to regulate guns, but we see a new law that states that the gun license holders, they can bring guns to campus in any public universities, including the University of Texas at Austin, the university that I worked at. In other words, so if you decide to study in Texas, right? So one of your classmates, they might carry guns in the classroom. And this is not something that is unique in Texas. Actually, many other conservative states, such as Idaho, Colorado, Texas, Utah, they also have this open carry laws. So I know a lot of the participants today are from Asia, so you might be wondering why Americans, especially conservatives, Republicans, why they love guns so much. So let me give you just a little bit on history. So America's gun culture can date back to its Revolutionary War. And in early time, Americans, they depend on guns, firearms to protect themselves. So many people actually believed it is the armed citizen soldiers. They want America's freedom from English rule. So they have this very famous amendment, the Second Amendment, and that protects individuals' right to hold guns. So right now, most Republicans, conservatives in the United States, they still firmly support gun rights. They believe they use guns to protect themselves, and they believe for all the gun violence, it's not because of guns, because they believe guns don't kill people. It's actually people kill people. On the other hand, Democrats or liberals, they support gun regulations. So like people in many other countries, this group of Americans, meaning liberals, Democrats, they believe the lack of gun regulation is actually the main reason for gun violence. So you can see gun violence is actually a very polarized issue in the United States. So different people, Democrats, Republicans, they have very different ideas. So if you look at this chart, this shows you the shares of Republicans and Democrats who think the US should prioritize gun rights over controlling gun ownership. And as you can see, the gap, the polarization is even worse over time, right? And right now, Republicans became even more focused on gun rights. But if we take a step back, to start with, Americans don't even agree gun violence is one of the most important problems facing the country. So if you look at this chart, this is one of the Gallup polls. And this company, they survey people, ask Americans, what are the most important problems facing the country on a regular basis. And this chart shows you their results about the gun control topic in the year of 2018. So you can see in January of that year, only 1% of Americans thought the gun violence was one of the most important problems facing the country. So very few people thought this is one of the most important thing. And then February of 2018, so the Parkland shooting happened. So this was a very serious, deadly mass shooting case. A lot of students died in this mass shooting case. Then the month after that, in March, 13% of Americans thought gun violence was most important issue facing the countries. But then after a few months at the end of this year, the number dropped back to 1%. So that is the trend, that is the pattern, right? So every time something serious, something bad happened, like mass shootings, and that will increase people's awareness, bring out people's awareness of this gun violence issue. But people tend to forget, right? After a few months, people forget. And then not a lot of people will still think gun violence is a very important issue facing the country. And this is actually very concerning, because if citizens do not agree that this is a very important issue to be tackled, then very little pressure will be put on policymakers to take any actions. And this is a typical question that agenda setting scholars are trying to address. And that brings to the two overarching questions that I want to answer in this project. The first one is I wanted to see what contributes to the public indifference toward and a partisan divide over gun violence. And second, I wanted to see how do different types of news media, mainstream or partisan, how they influence the public opinion and behavior regarding this issue. And these two questions can be answered through the agenda setting theoretical framework. Okay, so you must be very familiar, many of you must be very familiar about agenda setting theory, so I'll be very brief to talk about the theoretical framework. So agenda setting is one of the most established famous popular theories in our field. Its basic idea is that the salience of issues and attributes can be transferred from the media to the public agenda. So agenda setting at the level 1 says the salience of the objects or the issues can be transferred from the media to the public agenda. So for example, if the media always talk about the gun violence issue, then the public will also think the gun violence issue is important. And that is agenda setting level 1. And second level of agenda setting focused on the attributes that describe a given object. So let's say the object that we are trying to examine is the gun violence, and there are a lot of different attributes or aspects that we can talk about the gun violence issue, right? There are like gun regulations, gun rights, public safety, mental health, and we can treat those aspects as attributes that describe this object. And according to agenda setting level 2, that says the salience of these attributes will be transferred from the media to the public's mind. In other words, if the media always talk about the gun regulation aspect of the gun violence issue, then when the people thinking are trying to consider the gun violence issue, they might think the gun regulation aspect is the most important. So that is agenda setting level 2. And of course, we also have now the third level of agenda setting that says the interrelationships, the associations between different objects and attributes can be transferred from the media to the public. So this is also something that my advisor, Dr. McCombs, and I worked on in the past few years. And we term it the network agenda setting model. And we also publish a book introducing the theoretical and the methodological framework of this model, or the third level of agenda setting theory. But for this project, we still focus on the first and second level of agenda setting, trying to see whether the media can set the public's agenda in terms of the gun violence issue. So again, the object we are considering here is the gun violence issue. So at the level 1, we want to see if the exposure to the gun violence issue in the news media will increase the salience or the prominence of this object in the public's mind. So that's level 1. And second, we wanted to see whether the exposure to different attributes of the gun violence issue will increase the salience of the attributes in people's mind. And of course, for any research projects, we want to make some, further contributions in terms of theories and methods, right? So we want to advance this theory in 3 directions. So first, we want to look at different attributes. So traditionally, when people do agenda setting research, they will look at the different aspects of gun violence issue, right? Like the gun regulation, public safety, mental health, the attributes that I mentioned earlier. But for this study, we also want to see a specific pair of frames as attributes, and we want to see whether those frames will have stronger, which of these frames will have stronger agenda setting effect. So if you're familiar with framing literature, you'll probably have heard about this pair of frames, episodic and thematic frames. So episodic frames, they usually focus on concrete events or individuals' stories, right? And thematic frames, they usually put the story in a broader context. So let me give you some examples. So these are some headlines in our data set about the gun violence. So for example, if you look at the first one and the third one, right, they talk about individuals' incident, right? And they talk about individuals' stories. But if you look at the second and the fourth headlines, these are actually the so-called thematically framed news, because they focus on the larger arguments, larger discussion. The second one discuss the gun laws, right? And then the fourth one talk about the mental health issues. So based on the literature, we hypothesize on episodically framed stories actually have a stronger emotional appeal, and that may lead to stronger agenda setting effects. And we believe this is particularly relevant in a polarized political environment. So in a polarized political environment, a lot of people, especially partisans, right, they already have very strong opinions in their minds. So if you still present them with a lot of arguments or discussion points, they might not be able to persuade it. But if you show them, individual stories, individual incidents, those stories might be more effective. So that is the first direction we want to go. So we want to look at the effects of different attributes, but not in terms of the traditionally examined perspectives, but also in terms of this pair of episodic and thematic frame. And the second direction we want to go is to look at different media agendas and different public agendas. So for agenda setting research, usually people will treat mainstream media as a group and the public opinion as a group. And they correlate the two and trying to find a correlation between the two groups of agenda. But now in this fragmented media environment, different people might have very different media diets, right? So we want to look at how different types of media, such as mainstream media and different types of partisan media, and how that influence different people's minds. And in order to look at it, here we introduce another theory. You also might have heard about it, selective exposure. That says individuals tend to choose media outlets that provide content aligned with their own beliefs and try to avoid media content that are contrary, that are not consistent with their own beliefs. And in our research context, that means Democrats always try to seek out the Democrats leaning media, and the Republicans might want to look for information, consume news from Republican leaning media. And if we apply this idea to agenda setting, and it will be interesting to look at what we call the selective agenda setting effect. That means Republican media are more likely to set agenda of Republicans, and Democrat media are more likely to set agenda on Democrats. So that is the second direction we want to go. We wanted to see how different types of news media, conservative media, liberal media, and mainstream media, how that influenced people of different political orientation. And we draw upon not only the agenda setting theory, but also this selective exposure concept. And finally, the third direction we want to go is to look at the consequences or the behavioral outcomes of agenda setting. So usually agenda setting research will look at how the media will influence what we think, how we think. And in this project, we also want to further look at whether the agenda setting will lead to any actions. And this actually speaks to the normative goal of agenda setting. So early scholars of agenda setting like McCombs, Donshaw, they actually argue that news media should build a consensus among citizens by prioritizing certain issues and social problems, and then encourage individuals to take actions toward fixing problems. And specifically in our research context, we consider social media expression, like people's discussion about the gun violence issue on social media, as a type of actions. So in the United States, like in many other countries, social media such as Twitter and Facebook, those platforms provide citizens more opportunities to talk about public issues, right? So including the gun violence issue examined here. So the idea is that if the news media are powerful enough to influence people's opinions and encourage them to say something on social media, and this discussion on social media might be able to influence policy making. Okay, so I won't list all the hypotheses, but this chart summarizes what we plan to do in this project. So basically, we would like to advance the theory in three ways. First, we want to consider attributes, not only in terms of different aspects of the issue, but also in terms of this pair of episodic and thematic frames. And second, we want to look at the agenda-setting impact of both partisan media and mainstream media and how they influence individuals of different political orientations. And the third, we want to consider the behavioral outcomes of agenda setting effect. We want to see whether media's agenda setting will further lead to some actions, meaning the social media expression in our research context. So this is the theoretical framework and the questions and the hypotheses for this project. Okay, so now let me turn to the research design. So if you have some chance to look at the agenda setting literature, so you will see most of the agenda setting research, they use an aggregated level analysis to measure the effect. In other words, they will put all the media outlets together to look at, what are the most important issues, what are the second most important issue in terms of the frequency, and they will put all the public opinion together, for example, the survey results, right, to see what is the issue that the most people name as the most important, and so forth. And then they correlated two groups of data and to see if there is any correlation. So this is called an aggregated level of analysis. But again, as I mentioned, now we are living in this fragmented, very diverse media environment, right? And many different individuals consume news from many different media. So this aggregated analysis might not be able to reflect what we experience right now. So in this study, we actually use an individual level analysis of agenda setting. We are trying to see each individual's news exposure and to see each individual's opinion and trying to see whether the exposure to different media content from different media outlets will influence that person's opinion and also behavioral changes. So this is the individual level analysis of agenda setting. But if you look at the literature, this type of analysis is very rare. And I guess one of the reasons, one challenge is that because if you want to measure on individual level agenda setting effect, you will have to measure, you'll have to analyze a very large number of media outlets and their produced news articles. And that involves a large data set, very lot of data, right? And that is why, as I mentioned, computational methods are very important here, because when we use advanced research methods like machine learning, we will be able to analyze more data, a larger data set that can help us to make this individual level agenda setting analysis possible. Okay, so now let me talk about the research design in detail. So for this individual level agenda setting analysis, we collected two sets of data. The first set of data is the media agenda, right? And then that is media content analysis. and we used computational analysis to analyze media content from different outlets. And the second set of data is on a panel survey, which is a two-wave panel survey. And then we used data analysis to match the two groups of data so we can estimate how each individual is exposed to media content from a specific media outlet and how that exposure will influence that person's opinion and behavioral change. So for the media content analysis, we collected data from this platform called Crimson Hexagon, and now it has a new brand name called Brand Watch. And we collected all the gun violence related news articles from 12 news websites. And that covers a range of media outlets in the United States, including mainstream and partisan media. So conservative media, for example, Fox News, Breitbart, and liberal media, including MSNBC, and so forth. And altogether, we collected on almost 43,000 articles from 2018. And we rely on many different sources to create our media list. So again, as you can see, for the United States, this is a media political ideology spectrum, right? So we included media from both the left side and right side, and also the mainstream media in the middle. And our goal is, and our data, so for this study, we did not look at the full articles, we just looked at the news headlines. And our goal is to classify this news headlines into the attributes that we want to look at. So gun regulations, gun rights, public safety, mental health. And we also want to classify news headlines in terms of the two frames that I mentioned, episodic versus thematic. And we used supervised learning, machine learning method to do the content analysis. So we started with manual content analysis to manually label 2,000 headlines. And this is considered ground truth, right? And we train a machine learning model, have the model to learn how we label the headlines and create a model to predict the attributes for the rest of the data. And for this machine learning model, we use the supervised machine learning model. We also rely on the deep learning model called BERT. So let me say a few words about the machine learning models used in the study. Because this is a computational workshop, so I'll spend a little bit more time to introduce what is AI, what is machine learning, what is BERT, what is deep learning. We talk about AI a lot recently, but in fact, AI is not new at all. It started in 1950s. So AI itself is a very broad term, and it includes everything about like how computers will mimic human behaviors, right? And machine learning is actually a subset of AI. It train models to learn how human beings do things so the machine can do it itself. And in our research context, we will train a model to learn how humans classify news headlines into different attributes, right? And then the machine can do itself later on. And deep learning is a subset of machine learning, and we will talk about that in a second. But let me say a few more words about machine learning. So for machine learning, there are two basic groups. One is unsupervised, and the other one is supervised. Unsupervised meaning you do not provide any human insights, right? In our context, you do not provide any human annotations. You just have the machine to process the data and generate, for example, some patterns and topics for you to use. But the supervised machine learning, meaning that you do provide some supervision, right? And in our context, we do provide some so-called ground truth data, the annotations that we did, right? And supervised machine to learn how humans annotate the news headlines, and the machine can do the classification later on automatically. And within supervised, there are also two groups, classification and regression. So classification meaning that you want to classify the content into different categories, right? So for example, if we want to classify emails into spam and not spam, or email into like priority, right? That is a classification problem. In our research context, we want to classify news headlines into different attributes like gun rights, gun regulations. This is also a classification problem. And for the regression, meaning that you can also have continuous variable, right? And you can have a machine learning model to, for example, to predict how old you are based on the pictures that you provide. And again, in our research project, we are using a supervised machine learning model, and our problem is a classification problem. And in our study, we actually do use a deep learning model, and this is an advanced set of model within machine learning. And it is based on an artificial neural network. So artificial neural networks, it consists input and output layers, as well as the hidden layers in the middle. And that hidden layers consist of a large number of units that transform the input layers into something output layers can use. So let me try to relate it to our project, right? So in our case, the input layers include text and our human annotated data, like the human annotations, right? And those input features will be transformed into a very complicated network of nodes, and that can help us to make predictions of other news headlines. So the hidden layers actually, the part in the middle, it is a black box. No one knows how it works. But in order to make it work, you need to have a very large data set, and you need to have a very large amount of computational power. And the deep learning model that we use is called BERT. And this is something that Google developed in 2018. And it is a NLP, natural language processing deep learning model, and it is very influential in the NLP world. So BERT is actually superior to many other text classification models. For example, the bag of words models that treat each word separately. BERT is superior because it also considers the relationships between words and also the context of the words in the text. So to put it simply, the BERT can help us to understand the nuances and the context of the words in the text. And the BERT model is also trained on a very large data set, for example, all the Wikipedia pages and a lot of books. But the thing is that it is not easy to build a very powerful model like BERT for ourselves. So what can we do? And there's something called transfer learning, meaning that we transfer the insights from BERT to our own project, and that will add to our supervised machine learning model to improve the accuracy of the prediction. Again, to put it simply, the machine will first obtain some knowledge from BERT about how to classify texts, right? And then learning how humans do so will further improve the classification and accuracy. So for example, let's say, again, our goal is to predict, right, if email is a spam email or not spam email. And our features, our input will be the text of the emails, right? And probably we'll have some other metadata. And at first, we will have BERT to learn the patterns from the text. So we already have some ideas about the text, right? And then we provide our annotations, for example, some ground truth on data about spam emails and not spam emails, and that will further increase the accuracy of the prediction model. And BERT actually can do a lot of different things, and it can help us to finish sentences, right? And it actually can achieve the accuracy as good as humans. And if you have experience using email like Gmail, you might also notice that sometimes the system will also help us finish the sentences. That's exactly what I'm talking about, because the model will understand the relationships between the words and will understand the words in context. And the BERT was created in 2018 but it's still very popular today after a few years. But there are a lot of extensions and advancements. For example, now we have multilingual BERT, right? And that can process multilingual data. And we also have the specific BERT models that can process specific type of text data like social media texts, like tweets. And other companies like China's Baidu, they also created a deep learning model called ERNIE, and that is specialized to do analysis within the Chinese data. And of course, nowadays, we also talk about ChatGPT, right? And we can also rely on those generative models to help us to annotate text. And that's another topic maybe we can talk about the other day. And again, back to our project. We used a supervised machine learning model, and we rely on the insight of BERT, and that helped us to predict, to classify the news headlines into different attributes, and also the episodic versus the thematic frame. And these are the results of the model evaluations. And you can see the performance is actually very good on all above 0.8. So once we have this model created, we use it to predict the content categories of all the remaining headlines, and that is the 43,000 news headlines. So we all classified them into the attributes and also the episodic versus the thematic frames. And that is the first set of data, that is the media content analysis. And the second set of data is the public survey. So during the same time that we did a content analysis, which was around the 2018 US midterm elections, we did a two-wave national panel survey. And we had on about 1,000 respondents, they completed both waves of the surveys. And in both waves, we also measured the variables that we want to look at for the first and second level of agenda setting. For the first level, we want to see people's perceived issue importance, right? To what extent they consider the gun violence issue is an important issue. And in the survey, we also measure their attribute perception because we want to see the second level of agenda setting, right? So we have questions about gun regulation, gun rights, public safety, and mental health. And because we want to look at the consequences of agenda setting, right? We wanted to see whether this agenda setting effect will further encourage people to express, to discuss the gun violence issue on social media. So in the survey, we also asked them how often they post their thoughts about the gun violence issue on social media. And this is very important. We also asked about their media use. If you remember, in the part of a content analysis, we analyzed 25 news media outlets, right? And in order to estimate each individual's exposure of these media outlets, so in the surveys, we also asked them how often they use each of the 25 media outlets. For example, we asked them how often did they get news from New York Times, how often they get news from CNN, and so forth. With that data, we will be able to match the content analysis data and the survey data later on. Okay, now let me try to explain what we did in terms of the matching the content analysis data and the survey data. Our goal is to for each person, our goal is trying to create a media exposure index. So basically the index is based on the gun violence salience times media use. So, and for each media outlet like New York Times, CNN, we will see the number of articles published between the two waves of the survey, and we will use that number to times or to multiply it by each person's use of that particular media outlet. So let me give you an example. So let's say we have a respondent X, right? And he did the first survey at this date, October the 1st, 2018. And the second survey he finished was on this date, November the 1st, 2018. So we will see the number of gun violence articles published on New York Times between these 2 dates, right? And we will use that number to times this person's media use frequency. Because in the survey, we will ask people, how often do you get news from New York Times, right? And then he will say, never, rarely, sometimes, often, always. So if it is always, then the index, so let's say at this time, New York Times published 100 articles about gun violence, right? And this person answered, he always consumed news from New York Times, then the index for that person is 100, right? But if the person said that he only consumed news from New York Times sometimes, then we will times 100, multiplied 100 by 0.5, then the media exposure index of New York Times for this person is 50, right? I hope you get an idea about our matching strategy. So we did the same thing for each media outlets, and then we group the media outlets based on their media categories: mainstream media, conservative media, and the liberal media. So for each person, he will have a mainstream media exposure index, conservative media exposure index, and the liberal media exposure index. So that way we will be able to estimate each person's exposure of gun violence articles from these different types of media. And we did the same thing to measure each person's exposure to different attributes or different aspects of the gun violence issue from different media categories. So with that data, we will be able to do the data analysis. So we had this regression model to see the media, to use media exposure index to predict the person's perceived gun violence in wave 2, because we have 2 ways of surveys, if you remember. We also did a mediation analysis to see whether the media exposure index will predict perceived gun importance, in turn predict the social media expression for each person. And we also see whether the model will be moderated by the person's political orientation. So that is the idea, the basic idea of our research design. And we have published 2 articles. So if you wanted to know details, there will be more information in those published articles. All right, so we have a lot of findings, but I will not be able to talk about them all. So I will focus on some interesting findings, the most interesting findings from these projects. So first, we found that mainstream media did set the public agenda, especially the agenda of conservatives. In other words, the more the conservatives are exposed to mainstream media, the more likely they will believe the issue is more important. And in particular, their exposure to episodic framing of gun violence is more effective. In other words, the episodic framing works. This is actually consistent to our hypothesis. And this may be because, again, many conservatives, they might already have very strong opinions about the gun violence issue, right? So if you want to talk about more discussion points, arguments, they are not going to buy it. But if you show them some individual stories that have some personal and emotional appeal, and those stories might be more effective in this case. And along this line, we found that the mainstream media has this bridging effect, right? So if you look at this chart, the x-axis represent the mainstream media episodic framing exposure, and the y-axis represent their perceived importance. So for those low exposure people, actually the liberal-oriented citizens and conservative-oriented citizens, they have a large gap in terms of whether the gun violence issue is important or not, right? But if you look at a high exposure group, their perceived importance of the gun violence issue are at a very similar level. And second, we found the mediation effect is significant. In other words, we did find the behavioral outcome, behavioral consequences of agenda setting. And we found that mainstream media not only influence what we think, on how we think, it will also influence our behaviors. And that is the second significant finding that we got from this project. And finally, we did not find any agenda setting effect of partisan media. That is, there's no so-called selective agenda setting effect. But it turned out that conservative media had this agenda deflating effect. In other words, the more people are exposed to conservative media's discussion of the gun violence issue, the less important they will consider the gun violence issue, and the less likely they're going to talk about this gun violence issue on social media. So this might speak to the defensive position of conservative media, right? They probably do not want people to consider the gun violence is important and do not want people to talk about this issue too much. And in particular, we found this effect is especially effective among liberals. So this is a cross-cutting effect. And this is quite interesting, and that there might be many reasons that can help us to understand these findings. So for example, maybe ceiling effect is one of the reasons. So maybe conservatives, they already thought the gun violence is not important. So any more exposure are not going to change their mind, because their point of perceived gun importance is also already very low. But on the other hand, liberals might start with a high perceived importance level. So exposure to the constitutional information, the constitutional content from conservative media may make them reconsider their issue priority. And if we look more closely with the attributes, so we'll see that the conservative media will make people think the gun regulation aspect of the gun violence issue is not important. Instead, they will make people to think this is a mental health issue. In other words, the conservative media might be able to distract people's attention from the gun-related aspects of the issue, but make people think this is a health issue. So people might not talk about the gun violence itself on social media, but might go into a very different direction, a health topic instead. All right, so let me give you a summary of our findings. So first, about the project itself, right? First, we found that different media have different effects, and for mainstream media, they are still very powerful in shaping the audience opinions and encourage actions, not only change what we think, but also will change our behaviors. And the mainstream media may be able to still very powerful, still be able to contribute to a more informed and active public. And in particular, in terms of the attributes, we found that episodically framed news articles are especially effective to change people's minds. And on the other hand, we found that some partisan media, conservative media, they not only deflate the agenda, but also serve to deactivate the public. In other words, partisan media might further contribute to the polarization of the public opinion and the social media discussion in the context of US at least. And also we found this cross-cutting media effect very interesting, and we might want to do more research about it and maybe apply it to many other contexts in addition to the gun violence issue, in addition to the US context. And more importantly, I wanted to say a few words about the big data analysis versus theory building, because this is a computational workshop. And again, as I said at the beginning, that our goal as comm scholar, although we want to learn methods, right? We want to learn computational methods, but ultimately we want to use the methods to help us to build theories, to answer interesting questions. And I hope my study provides an example to show you how the use of computational methods can advance some, classic old theories in our field to further our understandings about the media effects from a more nuanced perspective. And I also want to use these studies to show you we can combine computational methods and traditional communication research methods survey in this example, so we can, and be able to answer more questions that we were not be able to answer on earlier. And finally, I want to discuss another topic about the big data analysis. So I know a lot of you at the workshop, you already have a lot of experience of doing computational methods, but probably there are still some students who might wonder, how can we get started to do the so-called big data analysis or the computational communication research? So in our field, we actually have this digital divide, right? We have big data rich versus big data poor. Some students, like many of you, some scholars, some students like many of you, you do have the abilities and you might have the resources, access to a lot of computational resources, computational tools to do computational research. But on the other hand, I guess there are also other scholars. They do also want to do some computational research, but they may not be able to get access to a lot of the tools and resources. And especially for those state-of-the-art advanced research methods, such as deep learning, like the BERT that I introduced, it will require very lot of computer science knowledge, coding knowledge, and also computational power. And this is not something an individual scholar, individual student can handle easily. So with that in mind, on my team, the AIM team, we also created something called Open Framing AI. We also want to do something to serve the community. And we hope that we can create a system and online tool that social science scholars, not just comm scholars, but social science researchers, and if they do not have a lot of programming knowledge, but they can use our platform to do some computational research. And it is a click and run program. So you do not need to have any programming knowledge. You just need to click different buttons, upload your data, and we will provide the results. And this tool is completely free, open source, transparent. We have all the codes available. And also, very importantly, our tool is created based on the framing theory, one of the other very famous theory in our field of communication and journalism studies. And we also published an article to talk about the theoretical and the methodological implications framework of this tool. And if you are interested, so it is a still beta version, and there might be a lot of problems. But if you are interested, you might want to check it out. Okay, so if we have time, I do want to show you the system a little bit. So this is the open framing program, and we have just tutorials, and we have a lot of information to show you on how the system will work. So if you go to demo, we also have case studies. Actually, it is the gun violence project that I present today to show you how you can use our system to do the computational analysis, including topic modeling, unsupervised machine learning, and also supervised learning, the BERT model step by step. So if you go to get started, so you can do, for example, topic modeling, you can upload your data, and we will do the analysis for you. And if you go to, for example, step 4, this is the BERT model, and actually we used an extension of BERT, XLM or Roberta, for the analysis. So you can upload your data, upload your annotation, so you can use our system to do the deep learning model, and that may be able to help you to work on your analysis. Okay, so and we also have FAQ to trying to help you to understand what is the open framing AI, on what is BERT, what is topic modeling. So there are a lot of information for you to look at. And this is something that we want to do as a team to contribute to our community of communication research. Okay, so this is all I have prepared, and I know we have time for Q&A, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much for the talk and introducing to us very useful system. So any question for Professor?
Hi, Professor. That's really fascinating topic. I kind of have two questions. The first more about the methodology. When I'm thinking about like classifying the framing of the news articles, I'm more familiar with topic modeling, and so the approach that I take is this sort of bottom up, where I let the data sort of generate the topics, and then I do the human coding for classifying the topics. And so it's interesting to see you kind of do the reverse, and where you use the human coding to train a model to then classify the framing. And I was wondering if there was discussion on like what types of approaches to go, on why you decided with this one, and if you thought of going the other way around for that. That's a methodology question.
Okay, so if I understand correct, so you said that some scholars use topic modeling to identify frames, right? But I actually use a supervised approach to analyze frames, right? So this is a topic that I've been thinking a lot. And I do think in terms of framing, there are a very large amount of literature that tells us what are the frames that exist and resonant with the audience. So for example, there are some generic frames, right? Like on public interest, conflict, economic consequences, and there are some issue-specific frames, right? That's why I think if we want to make some contribution to the literature, using topic modeling, those unsupervised approach only is not sufficient. Because a lot of the times, if you use topic modeling to look at the topics might not be consistent to the frames that we have already found from the literature. So we cannot say the topics are equal to frames. But I do think topic modeling is useful as the first step of analysis, because we do have existing frames, but sometimes if we have a new topic, a new discussion, there will be some new frames emerged, right? So using topic modeling can be a very useful first step of analysis to help us to understand the data. And possibly we'll be able to identify some new frames. But using topic modeling itself is not sufficient. After that, we still want to use, for example, supervised learning to classify frames, both existing ones and also the new frames. So if you remember the framework that I introduced in the open framing AI thing, that is exactly the approach that we propose, right? So use topic modeling first, read literature, consider both, and create a list of frames, and then use supervised learning to classify those frames. So this is what I think.
Awesome. Yeah, that was really great. Thank you. And then the second question I kind of had was understanding how people think about the media and whether the outlet is considered liberal and conservative. And so when I was thinking about the mainstream media, I was wondering if you had any data from the participants on whether they perceived those media outlets as being sort of neutral, or if they perceive that as being liberal or conservative. I can see both participants in either of the divide, thinking that the mainstream media may be one political agenda or the other. And so I was just curious.
Yeah. This is a very good question, and I get this question a lot from reviewers as well. Because for our analysis, we arbitrarily put the media outlets into three categories, right? Conservative, liberal, and mainstream. But of course, if you're talking about mainstream, like New York Times, some people will say it is liberal leaning, right? So we put there's no like neutral, perfectly neutral media. And within the mainstream media outlets, New York Times might be very different from many other media, right? So I think a more nuanced perspective maybe is to look at the media effect of each individual media outlet to see maybe New York Times effect on the individuals, Fox News effect on people. Even if you not just mainstream media, if you look at conservative media and liberal media, right? And there are also variances within each category. So I think you have a very valid point. So we, for the sake of our analysis, we create three media categories. But in order to understand the nuances of media effect, we might want to, for future research, we might want to look at the media effect of each individual media outlet. But you are right. There is no perfectly neutral media. Like I said, New York Times, many people think it is, you know, a little bit liberal leaning, but some people will use the word like maybe likely liberal leaning and then maybe hardcore liberal media. So when I talk about mainstream media, I'm talking about media almost in the middle, but they're not 100% neutral.
Awesome, yeah. Thank you. Very cool.
Thank you for the questions.
In fact, I'm actually one of the authors. So we actually use a website called Allside. And they have a construction of the media bias. Like they have a 5-point indicator of whether it's more left or more conservative or more right. And their information is based on a complex index based on like they did some survey on people, like ask people like, do you think it's more liberal or conservative? Right. So they also have some like expert rating. So they combine this to construct this rating. So we use that to divide the different people.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I think I was thinking in where like I see that at the aggregate of where people see that, but as an individual, they might see for example, I know somebody who watches InfoWars, and I know a lot of people who see that very conservative, and it seems like it was very conservative on there. But if you ask sometimes a conservative, they see it as neutral. And so I was interested in seeing of like how these how their own perceptions might
yeah, I guess that alone can be a good paper.
Yeah.
Like how people think that they are not biased themselves.
Yeah. It's very, very cool though.
I do want to add, Ian, one of the participants in this workshop is and co-author of one of the papers that I presented. So I guess I see Ian there. So you might also, Ian can also help answer questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I don't know if you're. Thank you.
Any other question?
Good morning. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm just wondering, since you mentioned about framing, one of the difficulties that I faced while framing, identifying frames is like those aspects of reality, which is like cause, moral evaluation, recommendation, or treatment. I mean, do we need to train the model, or and I'm very new to computational research. So, I mean, when I was doing these manually, it was very difficult to identify some of these traits because all four are not present sometimes. How would a machine go about it?
You mean it's very hard to identify frames?
Identifying frames is one aspect, but those aspects of reality, which aspects of frame like causation, who caused it, what's the source, moral evaluation, recommendation, or treatment. I mean, I'm talking about Robert Eichmann's framing theory. So, do we get to identify such things using computational methods?
So there is an approach and that actually is based on this concept of framing elements. So they treat each frame as a framing package, right? And each package is consists of different framing elements. And as you mentioned, that will be like actors, right? And different topics and maybe and many other aspects. And there are articles on research. Ask Ian about the specific papers, and she will know it. But their idea, so we also had a paper are working on it. So the idea is that the first step is to use different methods like topic modeling or other entity recognition to identify those elements. And the second step is to use something called community detection to detect the communities or clusters of framing elements within the text. And they will treat each cluster as a framing package. And that's also something that people already have been doing. So if you are interested, I would recommend. So I can, if you send me email, I will forward the articles to you. But if you, I don't exactly remember the specific approach, I remember, but basically they are working on detecting frames based on framing elements.
Okay, thanks a lot. And a follow-up question is, one of the things we did while doing, we worked on a citizenship issue, related to protests in India. So how different news outlets frame the issue of citizenship in India. We uh, gathered around 576 articles in a span of 1 week when the protests were at their spike. So one of the things we did was to write an origin frame or a neutral frame and then try to measure the distances when it gives a polarization or we were talking about liberal or conservative. But we were trying to look at more nuanced approach, how each newslet is away from the neutral or like zero. We are trying to measure the distances of how far they are away from neutrality as well. Can we do the same? I hope you got what I'm trying to say. Objective news, like how we will write neutral news and see the same how it got reported because we were also doing some of us our researchers were present at the protest site. They are trained reporters, so they wrote it neutrally. And one of the things we did is to how it deviates from the neutral argument or like supposedly neutral argument from our side and try to measure the distances. Can we do something similar? Yeah.
I think that is a very difficult task. You're trying to sort of measure media bias, right? Like how far it is from the media reality. Yeah, but I've seen something. So maybe you can, there's a method called crowdsourcing. So have not just, I think now you have reporters to help you to decide if this coverage, this news is neutral or not, right? Maybe you can show it to a lot of people, not just reporters, but also citizens to have them to measure the bias or the neutrality of the news. So this is a difficult task. But maybe crowdsourcing is one of the approaches that you can try. And I do want to read your work because that is a very difficult task.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Any question?
Hi, Prabhu. Nice to meet you. I don't think we have met at the conference. I'm Shmayan. I'm one of the co-organizers at SICSS here. And I wanted to just ask about your experience. So one of the things that, as within quotes, computational social scientists, one of the things I try to push back against is the idea that computational social science can replace traditional methods. And I see that even in your research, you successfully use the traditional methods in conjunction with computational methods, right? So I was hoping you could talk a bit more about where, like for when we're doing say topic modeling, or when we're doing even running machine learning models, there's always a need for validation of our results, because there's always be reviewers who'll be like, sure, you're using a fancy model, but how do we know it's accurate, or how do we know it's giving the correct results? And so I was wondering, how do you validate um, like deep learning output, right? So like how do you validate results of any like for example bird topic or something? What are the, for example, what we have done is often validate a subsample using human coders. Could you maybe talk more about how you would go about doing some of these validation exercises when using computational methods that are not very easily interpretable to an outside reviewer?
Sure. So for any supervised machine learning, before we use the model, there's always of this validation step, right? So some of you might be familiar. So if you have, for example, 2,000 annotated news headlines, and of course, we have to first rely on our traditional research method, content analysis, to annotate these news headlines. Let's say we annotate these news headlines into episodic frame versus thematic frame, right? And we will have a training set and we will have a testing set, right? So maybe on 1,500 of them are training set. And we are trying to build a model based on this 1,500 annotated news headlines to build a model, right? And then we will use this model to predict the remaining 500 news headlines as if it was not annotated. And then we will compare the results from the supervised learning and the human annotations, right? And we have all of these measures like precision and recall. And based on my experience, usually on any number above 0.8 will be considered robust enough. And if it is above 0.8 in terms of precision and recall, we will go ahead to use the model to predict the news headlines in our remaining data set, right? But if it's not, then we'll have to come back to revisit our model.
Yeah, I was asking more specifically about the remaining data set bit, right? Because there's always questions about whether a method that may have learned well on the training data would work well on the actual, not even the testing data, but on the validation data set, on the unlabeled data set, right? So do you also try and validate, like, if not the entire data set, which is really possible, because if it was, then we would be doing computational methods, at least a sample of them, to see if on the final, after the model has run, after the model has given you these labels for the unlabeled data points, right? Do you also like manually tend to check us at least validate a subset of them? Because I mean, I keep getting reviewer comments about validation all the time, even when I'm using supervised models. Yeah.
I see. For my experience, the simple answer is no. So I just create a model and I, did everything I said before. And then we show this model is strong enough and I use it to predict the unlabeled data, right? But you might be right and the reviewers might be right, because if we are dealing with a very, very large data set, right, the part that we create a model may not be representative. So maybe there should be more things we should do to do more validations throughout the process of the research. So for me, my personal experience, I haven't got any challenge from reviewers, but what you mentioned is a valid point, and I might want to consider that for my research later.
I mean, yeah, what we did was, I mean, we had some, we randomly chose a subset of the unlabeled data, and then we manually did the validation ourselves, and the reviewers finally convinced that okay, the labels, at least in the subset it worked, and we were like, this is a random subset, so why do you think it won't work after this? And they seemed happy with that. But this took us a lot of time to do, so we were wondering if you had any shortcuts. But I see that you haven't had to face this problem yet. But yeah.
I do mention a little bit about the Chat GPT. So you might already have this discussion. So now people trying to use Chat GPT to annotate the data, right? And I've already seen papers that show the Chat GPT, the performance already as good as crowdsourcing.
Yeah.
So
But I
maybe
also
that's
see that these papers haven't been published yet. They're mostly all preprints. So I
right.
think that reviewers still haven't really accepted ChatGPT as a viable. I mean, I think it's not there yet. I think this is inertia. It'll probably get there, but not right now at least.
And yeah, but
Yeah.
I do this is the direction that we want to
Yeah.
go to see how powerful and how whether we can train ChatGPT to make it useful for our field.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Actually, good one.
Yeah.
So like the reviewers that is
You want
not.
to ask? This will come here to the cheese part of the conversation. That's there from there.
No, I'm just wondering because for just as Dr. Goh mentioned, the 500 coded, the 500 testing set is also a random subset of the whole data set.
Yeah.
Then why did the reviewer ask you to basically get another random sampling out of the whole data set to be manual?
Because I think the reviewer was worried that we are overfitting the training data, and basically wanted I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's probably because the reviewer came from a more civil science background.
Yeah.
I think that's the most viable reason. But I think it's becoming the norm for them to ask.
Yeah, but I guess we can argue that the 500 testing set is not
Yeah,
it's still a random.
It's still a random. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just they probably have complained that 500 is not big enough. Maybe.
I have to see the exact words, but we basically had to satisfy them by doing another balancing. So, yeah.
But I think for our research, our model is built on the 2000 labeled news headlines, right? And our population is 43K. So maybe the 2000 can represent the 43K, right? But if you think about, if we are dealing a data set that is billions of tweets, and we create a model based on 2000 tweets, and how can we use the 2000 tweets to represent the billions of data? So that's why I think reviewers might want us. So yes, the 500 you mentioned is randomly collected from the 2000, but the 500 is no way to represent the 10 billions of tweets, right? Okay. So I do think reviewers might have a point there.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no any further question, then we will end our session. So, no any other question? Okay, Professor, then thank you so much for your talk. Maybe we can give another post.
Thank you very much. Good luck with the rest of the session.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.